Till class. Oh, oh, you're early. It's not a problem. Let's get started then. Alrighty, welcome to another one of Mr. Lang's vlogs. Today, we're talking about that movement from nationalism to sectionalism here in the United States' history. This is right after the War of 1812, and we're going to start to see that although right after the war there's going to be a lot of nationalistic pride, there's also going to be a lot of negative going on as well, as you'll see. So first, let's talk about James Monroe, the next president after James Madison, and this whole era of new nationalism. So nationalism is the strong sense of pride or loyalty in one's country. So in this case, it's this huge amount of pride in your country. So if you're American, you're proud to be an American. Or maybe you're Italian, you're proud to be Italian. That's what nationalism is all about. And so the U.S. felt a very strong sense of nationalism following the War of 1812. Although, yes, granted, we didn't come out of that war unscathed, at the same time, we did go ahead and, well, come out thinking, hey, we survived the British again. And so this does create this era of good feelings, or as you saw on the previous slide, also some very bad feelings, which we'll be talking about. Now, one of the things we see during this era as well is the Monroe Doctrine. So James Monroe goes ahead and gets elected unanimously, almost. There was one person that threw their vote, and the reason why was because although he ran unopposed, nobody went against him. You would think you'd get a unanimous vote. Nobody could do it other than Washington. No one could top Washington. So even though James Monroe, who was good friends with Washington, and the last of these Virginian dynasty presidents, or even they call them the Knee Bridges presidents, really our first generation of presidents, they couldn't do it. They couldn't have him go ahead and also be voted in unanimously. So one person threw their vote. So essentially what it did was the president declared that the U.S. could consider any type of European colonization of the Americas. So we're talking North, South, and Central America to colonize the Western Hemisphere, essentially, to be dangerous to the U.S. Now, it wouldn't interfere with his already colonies, wouldn't interfere with that, but you got to kind of think, you know, do we have the jurisdiction to say, hey, you can't colonize South America, Central America, more of North America? No, but it was more of an understanding that here we are, don't come over to the Western Hemisphere and start to colonize, and we won't get involved in your affairs. And this actually does last for a very long time. And in fact, although it is called the Monroe Doctrine, because James Monroe is the one that spoke it, it's actually written by John Quincy Adams, which is his Secretary of State, soon to be President. Another big situation or event that happens during James Monroe's presidency is the Missouri Compromise. Now, this happens in 1820. Essentially, you had Alabama and Illinois had just been admitted to the Union, and Henry Clay had to go ahead and make two compromises with this, because Alabama went ahead and became in as a slave state. Illinois came in as a free state. One thing to note is how Congress was being set up back then. They would try to keep the difference between free states and slave states to be as equal as they can. Think about this. Why would they want to do that? Right. To keep that equality. If you have too many free states over slave states in Congress, they could vote to get rid of what? Exactly, slavery. And yet, if you do the opposite occurs, and you have more southern states that are slaves, that have slaves, outnumber the free states, you would have the possibility that slavery would, well, yeah, expand. So Henry Clay went ahead and made two compromises because the state, the territory now becoming a state, Missouri wanted to come in. The problem is, in 1820, Missouri wants to come in as a slave state, and there's no other state coming in as a free state. You can't upset that balance, right? So with what he comes up with, which again we almost were like ready to go to civil war right here and then over this. Henry Clay, the fire bell in the night, says with the exception of Missouri, slavery will not exist above the 3630 line. That's going to be the bottom border, the lower border of Missouri, the state. Maine is going to be a free state. So if you remember, Massachusetts was split into two parts. What is today current day Maine, and of course Massachusetts now is going to become a free state. And this guy is the fire bell in the night because of this. Literally, when everyone else is like, oh my goodness, what's going to happen? Like, how are we going to solve this issue? He came in clutch. The problem is it's the difficulty of slavery has been an issue in national politics, and now it's going to continue to be an issue. So here you go. This is the altogether the Missouri Compromise. You see Missouri there. That's going to be a slave state. Anything above that bottom border, that's going to be, again, free. Anything below that bottom border could be slave. So the Abolitionist Treaty also gets signed during Monroe's presidency. Again, Spain goes ahead and cedes Florida to us, or gives us Florida for $5 million. And of course, the southern boundary of Louisiana, the territory, is clarified. So again, big stuff here as well. And all the while, we're going through the Industrial Revolution. Now, the Industrial Revolution really is that change from the use of man and animal power to the use of water and steam power to power factories. This is huge because now we used to work on the cottage system where people would go ahead and create, say, for example, if you're making some sort of shirt, you'd have someone spin the yarn in one house, someone would collect that yarn, bring it to someone else to go ahead and spin into the shirt, and then continue right along to the person to dye it, etc. Here we did it all under one roof now, and it was all powered. So again, this is making it more efficient and cheaper, which is pretty great. Altogether, we're going to have huge internal improvements during this. Probably the biggest is the American system. Now, the American system, as you can see here, was, a lot of support, mainly in the western states, right? If you look at this graph below, you have 43 for this, internal improvements to fund it, and 0 against. That's pretty good. Again, the support to go ahead and fund those internal improvements was proposed. It's called the American system. Things that are going to put a tariff on imported goods. So imported goods cost more, people buy the American goods, again, keeps that money flowing here in the country. Again, making more railroads. This was, again, the reason why the West loved it so much is it would connect the West to the rest of the world, really the rest of the U.S., especially on the East Coast here. There's also going to be the recreation of the National Bank. This is going to be the second national bank. This is going to be taken down by Andrew Jackson, who will be our president soon enough. You have the Tariff Act of 1816 is one of the ones I was talking about. 25% duty on imported factory goods. Oof. And of course, that transportation system. During this time, we also have the Second Great Awakening, this revival of, again, religion. Now, we saw the Great Awakening during the early settlements. Here is really why they call it the Second Great Awakening. And one of the biggest preachers was Charles G. Finney, very famous preacher. Actually, he lived to be over 100 years old. He goes ahead and he states probably one of the most, this is a witness, mind you, of one of his soul-shaking conversions of one of his masses, essentially. It says, the ranges of tents, the fires reflecting light, the candles and lamps illuminating the encampment, hundreds moving to and fro, the preaching, praying, singing, and shouting, like the sound of many waters, was enough to swallow up all the powers of contemplation. It really was incredible, I'm sure, to be in one of those sermons. During this time, we have a lot of little utopias and a lot of little religions. One of the biggest ones is the Mormons. So the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is also what they're known as here. We have Joe Smith, who's going to be really going to be the founder of the Mormons. In 1823, he was given golden tablets by God, and by 1830, he had written their book, the Book of Mormon. Now, he is going to, unfortunately, be murdered, and unfortunately, they're going to be kicked out of where they were. Originally, they were in New York, upstate New York, where a lot of these little utopias and religions, essentially flourished. And he is going to go ahead and say something very controversial, and that controversial saying, which we're going to get into in a moment, is going to go ahead and unfortunately wreak havoc on the Mormons, as they are going to be persecuted by a lot of other groups. And of course, going to lead to Joe Smith's murder. There's a lot of violence. So the Mormons do make this trek, and again, they go from upper state New York all the way down to Utah, Salt Lake City, where even today there's still a lot of Mormons that are in Salt Lake City. We also have the Shakers, again, Mother Ann Lee. So the Shakers are a group that are technically still around today, because they are a religious group that believed in just shaking away the actual evil. All right, so they would get together and they would have a Shaker meeting and they would shake away the evil. Hence why they got the name the Shakers. And again, you can see some of their quotes here. You know, if you take up your crosses against the works of generations and follow Christ in the regeneration, God will cleanse you from all unrighteousness. Remember, those are the cries who are in need and trouble, and then when you're in trouble, God may hear your cries. And of course, if you improve in one talent, God will give you another. So this is what your Shaker meeting would look like, you know. Again, they'd be shaking the evil away. And they're very famous for making furniture. Because these religions and these little utopian groups we're talking about do have to still make money. Again, they still got to survive, they still got to eat, right? So at the end of the day, they a lot of times have something they would make. The Juanita Utopia, the commune there, they're going to go ahead and make silverware, which if you look at some of your silverware in your house, it may say Juanita right on it, because they're from Juanita, New York. The Shaker furniture, very expensive, very well handcrafted furniture, which you may even have some of that around your house as well. We're also going to have during this time Transcendentalism, which is the belief that knowledge is found not only by observation of the world, but through reason, intuition, and personal spiritual experiences, man. Transcendentalists are essentially the hippies of the 1800s. They believe you transcend the limits of intellect and allow the emotions, know the soul, man, to create an original relationship with the universe. Again, they're all about getting in touch with nature. And so we are going to see some very famous Transcendentalist writers come out of this. So they're going to instinctively go ahead and reject any type of authority, any type of secular authority, organized authority. And so because of that, a lot of times we're going to see in extreme circumstances like Henry David Thoreau, he's going to literally reject society as a whole, essentially, and live off the land at Walden Pond in Concord. So again, we basically see that being in touch with nature, a lot of their writings has to do with that. Now, Ralph Waldo Emerson is one of the most, if not the most famous Transcendentalist writer. He wrote poetry such as Nature, Self-Reliance, The American Scholar as well. And just as famous, I would argue, is Henry David Thoreau, who is the one who lived off Walden Pond for 2 years in Concord, Mass. Here, he's going to make the poem Walden, Resistance to Civil Disobedience, amongst others. Again, really getting in touch with nature with his poetry, with both their poetries. So these utopian communes, you see, they flourished everywhere. You have Brook Farm in Massachusetts. You have the Shakers, who were a big part here too in Massachusetts. A lot of it is going to be right on that Massachusetts-New York border, as well as even up in New York as well. But they are going to be really, to be honest, they were created to be free of the ill effects of the cities. The cities were growing, and urban growth was becoming a big issue because there was a lot of evils in the city. This was a way to get away from those evils by literally going and moving out to these utopias. This was a response to those evil cities. So another probably very famous, probably one of the more famous ones, these utopias, is Robert Owen. Robert Owen goes ahead and creates really the first socialist experiment, the Village of Cooperation in New Harmony, Indiana. What that means is he basically created a socialist society, one that would have him as the leader, and you would trade services instead of money to go ahead and, well, live. So again, if I was a teacher, that would be my service to the commune. And if you were an auto technician, right, just bringing it up to speed here nowadays, that would be your service to the commune. So you wouldn't get paid for your work, but you would be paid in your service that you provided. That was the original plans for it, and we have New Harmony in 1832. It's still around today. It's not functioning. It's more of a almost like a museum. You can go ahead and check it out. which is pretty amazing. During this era, we also have a lot of different reforms. So we see the Second Great Awakening kind of reawakening a lot of thought and reform, and we do see a lot going on here. Dorothea Dix is very famous, as she goes ahead and does penitentiary reform. She's going to visit prisons and see how the mentally ill were treated. Oftentimes, they were thrown in prison without the care and help that they needed to get better. And so she's going to create these reforms, create these asylums, after going around, even to Massachusetts here, seeing all the asylums, reforms, and so on, and start to tell people about the horrible conditions she saw. In some cases, people who were mentally ill chained to a wall. It was crazy. And because of her efforts, among others, again, we really do have a much better treatment for people who need treatment for their mental health. She does go ahead and actually create an asylum as well. So during this time, we also have something called the Temperance movement, that demon rum. Again, hue and cry, drunkard. Temperance is when you try to go ahead and you get rid of alcohol. You may hear also prohibition. That is going to come into effect later in the 1920s, but here in the 1800s, we saw temperance actually, getting a really big stronghold on the country. In fact, the temperance movement, which again is an era that they tried to ban alcohol, it was very close to becoming a federal thing here. Many different states, many different counties, especially in counties, are going to go ahead and going to banish alcohol. And that's because, again, of the ill effects it had on people. You can see it made quite the dent. I mean, if you look at the annual consumption here in the graph, at its peak is prior to the temperance movement. And if you're thinking to yourself, why? Why are they trying to get rid of alcohol? Well, the fact of the matter is that many men would go to the pub, get drunk, come home, beat their wives, beat their children, and the women and children could do nothing about it. Because back then, women didn't have as many rights as we're going to see in a moment. There are going to be people who are going to fight for rights. But this was their way of saying, okay, let's stop this crazy consumption of alcohol. And they did. They made a huge effect on that. Again, they did put out different types of literature, such as the Drunkards Progress, which would show from the first class all the way to the grave. So it shows the whole spectrum there of what could happen. A little bit of obviously, it's hard to read here, but, from a glass to keep the cold out to suicide, again, it could happen, but it was a little extreme, right? We also have educational reform. Oh my goodness, how could we not talk about this? Again, Massachusetts is always on the forefront of education. Represent. We're the first state to establish tax support for local public schools, so you can go to school for free. Yay. And by 1860, every state had offered free public education, unfortunately to whites only, and in some cases males. We had one of the largest literacy rates because of this. And it all started with this guy, the father of American public education, Horace Mann. Now, Horace Mann actually grew up in Franklin, Massachusetts. In fact, if you go to Horace Mann Plaza down in Franklin, that's where his house once was. So again, he believed in a couple different things, including children were clay in the hands of teachers and school officials, and they were molded. Children are molded into a state of perfection. That's right. Getting molded right now. And again, he discouraged corporal punishment, which is a good thing, because again, beating students doesn't make them learn better by any means. Again, he's going to establish state teacher training programs, such as a school to teach teachers how to teach, known as Bridgewater Normal School, which again is still around today, but much expanded, called Bridgewater State University. Pretty cool, right? So, in addition to all this, we have a lot of changes. We're also going to get what they call, the cult of domesticity, which means essentially that a woman's sphere belonged in the house. That was her refuge from a cruel world. I know, crazy, horrible that people would think this back then, but that's what they thought. They thought her role was to civilize her husband and family. And in fact, a Massachusetts minister in 1830 said, "The power of a woman is her dependence. A woman who gives up that dependence on man to become a reformer yields the power God has given her for her protection, and her character becomes unnatural." Of course, we know this is not true at all today. But again, this gives you an idea of why women were fighting for rights. Again, the rights that women get to really enjoy today because of what people had to go through back then. Again, an early 19th century woman, again 1800s here, her rights were so limited. She basically had the rights of a minor. She was unable to vote. If she was single, she could own her own property. Second, she got married, no control of her property, and no control of her children. Again, she could not initiate the divorce. The divorce would be initiated by the man, and oftentimes the man would get the children. And women couldn't make wills, sign a contract, couldn't even bring suit to court without her husband's permission. As you can see, this was, in some cases, they would say, again, very close to slavery. Especially because, again, these are people who are also getting beaten in some cases. So this whole Second Great Awakening, this whole reform, helps really inspire women to essentially improve society, to go ahead and get more rights, to earn those rights. And so they do that with a couple different abolitionists, who are, again, people we're going to talk about in a little bit, who are against slavery, are also going to be for women's rights, as some consider really compared it to slavery. So you have the Grimke sisters here and Lucy Stone as well, but they're not the only ones. In fact, this is going to go ahead and, well, kind of go into one of the most famous meetings of women's rights. It's going to literally lead right into it. Because, of course, in Seneca Falls in 1848, we have huge powerhouses here: Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison. Big names of this era are going to meet and create the Declaration of Sentiments. We do see throughout the world this is going on, including in London. The World Anti-Slavery Convention occurred over there. There's also a split in the abolitionist movement, which is, again, to get rid of slavery. There's a split between should women have rights or not, as well, as crazy as that sounds. So at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, 300 people are in attendance, men and women, okay? So men as well. 100 are going to sign this Declaration of Sentiments, which is essentially a spoof yet an upgraded version of the Declaration of Independence, which you'll be reading. You're going to have 68 women sign it, 32 men sign it as well. And one of the most famous and powerful lines: all men and women are created equal. What? Awesome. You actually go there and see the signers of the Declaration of Sentiments as well. So we have to talk about the abolitionist movement here as well. This is the movement to go ahead and get rid of slavery. Frederick Douglass, who he himself is a runaway slave, ran away up to Massachusetts. In fact, he ran away and worked as a whaler in New Bedford. Again, he is a huge part of this abolitionist movement, a huge voice, if you will. Again, abolitionists want to get rid of slavery in America. It's not that they don't want it to just spread, they want it gone. And Frederick Douglass makes very famous the 4th of July speech. And in that speech, he goes ahead and he states what the 4th of July means to him. And, surprising, it doesn't mean anything. And so because of that, his speech is so powerful, that 4th of July speech, which we're going to take a peek at, as it does go ahead and really ring true for a lot of Americans here, a lot of African Americans. So he also does create the North Star, which is a fantastic newspaper, again, a very anti-slavery newspaper. Just like William Lloyd Garrison, which was Elizabeth Cady Stanton's husband, he creates the Liberator, another big anti-slavery newspaper. And how could we not talk about Moses? Oh my goodness, Harriet Tubman. I love Harriet Tubman. She's incredible. She has done amazing. Her life is essentially so many tragedies happened in her life. Again, she actually suffered a big brain injury when she was younger, in her teens, around 13, we think, where she was actually hit, and so she used to get these visions, and that would help her during her numerous journeys to the South to get slaves and help them run away to the North to freedom. So she's not only just one of the conductors on the Underground Railroad, which we're going to talk about in a moment. She herself had a $40,000 bounty on her head, and she still risked her life to get not only just her family members out, she goes ahead and risks her life to get just complete strangers out. to get slaves out. It's incredible. She's going to serve as a Union spy during the Civil War and even lead a group of men to go ahead and raid southern plantations and free more slaves. It is incredible. And she is, because of that, again, considered Moses. Again, just like Moses in the Bible. And she's going to lead them along the Underground Railroad. Now, the Underground Railroad is not underground, nor is it actually a railroad. It's actually just a system of stops that escaped slaves could take from the south to the north to get to freedom, and eventually even all the way to Canada. To just, even when things started to get really crazy, even throughout the U.S. And as you can see here, this is kind of an overview. It very much was way more detailed than this, as there would be only certain stops they could go to, certain houses they'd be running away often. There were bounties on their heads, so you had bounty hunters, both black and white, literally going up and trying to catch these runaway slaves. I could not imagine what these men and women and children went through. However, it's just a testament to what Harriet did, and others as well on the Underground Railroad, to go ahead and help free those slaves. Alright, and that's it for today. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you back in the classroom.